If you'd like to call me to talk about your experience of the Duke of Edinburgh Award, or if you met the Duke of Edinburgh, please call me on 0345 6060 973. You can, of course, text also at 84850, or you can tweet me at LBC. I've got a text message here. It says, David, I'm loving the idea that HRH Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was both a refugee and an immigrant to this country. Of course, his background and story is far from typical, but it does just show how wide-ranging the experience of refugees and immigration to this country can be. No one story is typical. They're all unique. And that's from Jason in Putney. I think, Jason, you put that beautifully. It's very, very striking. I think the idea of Philip's early life being so nomadic, so full of grief and pain to some extent, but the fact that here he is of the Greek royal family, but in fact Danish, German, Russian, becoming in so many ways the quintessential Englishman. That is definitely a story that I've reflected on over the last few days. But another part of Prince Philip's legacy, a very, very important part of his legacy, is that he is being remembered for his pioneering work promoting environmental causes, having encouraged conservation in his particular style throughout his life and long before it became fashionable. He toured the world raising the issue of the plight of wildlife, wildlife endangered by poaching, by deforestation, by pollution, photographing seals in Antarctica, feeding elephants in Africa, and posing with pandas in China. And in this year particularly, this pandemic that we're caught up with, of course, it's important to remember that we have the pandemic in part because of interrupting wildlife, in this case probably a bat somewhere in China. And so the issues that he was taking up long before they were fashionable, very, very, very important indeed. I'm joined now by Dominic Dyer, who is a wildlife campaigner and writer. Dominic, just give us a sense of how important the Duke's work was internationally, because he was a very strong international voice on issues of conservation.
Yes, I'd agree. And, it's important if you see what Sir David Attenborough has said after his death. He said he was one of the most important, absolutely huge influence in terms of international conservation. But it was quite a complicated journey, as everything in Prince Philip's life. If you go back to the early 1960s, he went on a royal tour of Nepal and actually took part in a tiger rhino hunt and actually killed a tiger at that time and a crocodile as well. And there's a picture of him posing with a dead 8-foot tiger. That was an early part of his life. But he went on a journey where he turned his back on killing and became a key conservationist. I think part of that was probably his friendship with Sir Peter Scott, who was the founder of the Wetland Wildlife Trust and went on to found the World Wildlife Fund as well. And he really got to know Peter and got very interested in his work. And he became president of WWF for its UK British side of the operations from 61 to 82. And as you said, he was more than just a figurehead. He travelled to over 50 countries. He became very actively engaged in this debate about biodiversity, deforestation, poaching, human-wildlife conflict, way before Sir David Attenborough and, Greta Thunberg and all the people that we're familiar with today. So he was pioneering in that way. And in many ways, because he was outspoken, because he could be quite controversial, he sort of, brought people's attention to this at a time when others weren't really thinking in the same way. I know if you look back at some of the important events that he spoke at, there was one particular conference where he really raised the issue in the sense of saying, this was at the conference on world pollution in Strasbourg in 1970. He famously said, it's totally useless for us here in this conference to say that we're going to wring our hands and we want to do something about what's happening with pollution unless we take action. If no one's willing to take action, nothing will change. And, people of his sort of position and public influence just didn't speak like that at that time.
I mean, let's just pause there. This is 1970.
Yes.
So this is before the term climate change is coined, certainly before the term climate emergency is coined. I remember being at school in the 1970s, and one used to talk about acid rain. That's what you sort of learnt about. I mean, just how bold would it have been to have someone so senior in the global community raising those issues? And I might say I'm not sure there were many politicians raising those issues at that stage.
Not. And I think, that's what he managed to do. And he turned WWF into a significant, influential organisation that could work with business, could work with politicians. He played a key role in the Commonwealth across Asia and Africa. He went to a number of key conservation projects and raised their profile and helped to get the business and political community to raise funds and to support them. And I think that was critical at that stage. And I think also, if you look at the Duke of Edinburgh Award scheme, I think that was partly really not just about trying to empower young people that came from disadvantaged backgrounds, but it was to connect them with the natural world. So, you were getting people out of the cities, you were getting them into the countryside. There were rock climbing, there were abseiling, there were canoeing. That type of thing that he believed in, I think, is crucially important then. It's even more important today that we open the countryside and we really understand the importance of the natural world, not least in this terrible pandemic we've been living through over the last year. So I think he was very pioneering, but he had his views. He was controversial back home because he believed in fox hunting. He never gave up supporting fox hunting, even when the Hunting Act was introduced in 2004. Great supporter of game bird shooting and, deer stalking. This does not endear him to many people in the wildlife conservation movement back in Britain. And I remember Fiona Bruce interviewing him in 2011. He said, "I'm a conservationist, not a bunny hugger." And he said during the time he was WWF president, he used to be surprised by the numbers of letters he got from people saying they were complaining about animals in zoos, which, I feel very passionate about in the work I do. And he said they didn't seem too concerned about animals in the wild. So he had his views. He wasn't going to move to a degree that some people would like to have seen him move, but he definitely was pioneering. He definitely had a huge international influence.
I mean, there is this view, isn't there, in conservation? I've certainly, when I've been with gamers, bird gamers, it is regulated, and they do talk about how you crop. You don't, it's not about making the species extinct. So there's this debate about extinction and cropping, if you like, that I know exists, and clearly
it is, but it's a complex one
of that.
It is. There's a complexity here, though, as well, because you get, for example, a situation where you're pushing the agenda to fight wildlife crime abroad, and we know that we have wildlife crime on shooting estates in Britain, where we get some of the most rare endangered species in the world, including golden eagles, for example, and heron harriers being illegally poisoned. So there is an issue of trying to look at it from both sides, and I think that's something that was somewhat difficult for Prince Philip because of his background. I suppose the challenge is really to his grandsons. It's to William and Harry as to how far they will go in terms of what they want to do on the conservation of wildlife in Britain as well as around the world in these areas as well.
Dominic Dyer, wildlife campaigner and writer, thank you so much for joining me on the show this afternoon, just to remind us of that contribution in conservation particularly. You're listening to David Lammy here on LBC, and the time now is 5 o'clock.
From Global